What a difference it makes. Football enjoyed like this, or like this. It's clear what the organisers of Euro 2020 prefer. Tens of thousands of fans will take their seats at Sunday's final in London. But in Japan, there's a different view. Tokyo's Olympics will take place in empty venues. The crowds of supporters seen as too risky. In both regions, COVID-19 cases are rising. So are the Europeans scoring an own goal? I'm Rob Watts in Berlin. Welcome to this COVID-19 special. The pandemic meant Europe's football fans were made to wait an extra year for Euro 2020 to kick off, hence the confusing clash of name and date. But with the continent yet to rid itself of coronavirus, the European Championship still didn't come without risk.
The joy of Euro 2020 summed up by Scotland fans. They were euphoric when their team earned a point against arch-rivals England at Wembley. But their tournament came to an end soon after. And there was another sting in the tail. A COVID outbreak, on and off the pitch. Scotland midfielder Billy Gilmour tested positive, forcing him into quarantine. A post-game chat meant England's Ben Chilwell and Mason Mount also had to isolate. Even more worryingly, it was later revealed almost 1,300 Scottish fans were infectious when they went to London. The World Health Organization says supporters travelling to games would be a recipe for disaster.
How are people getting there? Are they travelling in large, crowded convoys of buses? Are they taking individual measures when they're doing that? What's happening after the games when people leave the stadiums? Are they going into crowded bars and pubs to watch the matches? If this mixing is happening among people who are not fully vaccinated and there is the presence of the virus, there will be cases.
The problem isn't restricted to the UK. Finnish authorities say at least 300 fans were infected while following their national team, mostly at their 2 matches in St. Petersburg. That's contributed to a sharp rise in cases at home. But despite these connections between Euro 2020 and COVID outbreaks, UEFA is pressing ahead with hosting over 60,000 spectators for the final at Wembley. And politicians in several countries are furious at this. German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer accusing the governing body of putting profits over public health.
I think that UEFA's position is utterly irresponsible. A sports association should say clearly, we don't want it this way, and we're reducing the numbers of spectators.
Either Italy or England will be celebrating their country's sporting victory at Wembley on Sunday. But without further restrictions in London, fears of a COVID hangover will only rise.
Well, let's speak to Dr. Gerhard Scheuch. He's a former president of the International Society for Aerosols in Medicine. Thanks for joining us on the COVID-19 special. You were an advocate of getting football back up and running again during the pandemic, but now we are seeing cases rising, in part due to Euro 2020. Does that mean the tournament was a bad idea?
I think the tournament was not a bad idea. I think it depends on the incidents in the different countries, and we saw large differences. You mentioned the English and Scottish people that went to London and got infected, but in England we have an incidence, a 7-day incidence of about 300 right now. And in other countries, that was much lower. So, for example, in Germany, we had an incidence of 5, and we had no outbreaks when we had the stadium in Munich. And in Hungary, the incidences went down, and they had a full stadium at the beginning, from the beginning. So they started with an incidence of 10, and they are now at 2.5 or something like that. So we cannot say that football is a real big risk it really depends on the conditions in these different countries.
Yeah, but the one match that remains now is the final, which is going to be in the UK, which, as you say, has got one of the higher incidence rates in Europe. So how risky is a stadium full of 60,000+ people?
The stadium itself is not the problem. It's the travel to the stadium, as we saw or heard in this other discussions. It's a traveling to the stadium. It's the celebration after in the bars. It's the lounges in the stadium, the restrooms. So we know that outside we have very little infection. So it's an aerosol infection, and that happens most of the time in closed rooms. And this can also be a bus or an airplane or a toilet. Yeah. And I think these are the risky places.
So they're sort of peripheral to the actual match itself, I suppose. Euro 2020 has given us an interesting case study because the matches have been taking place in different countries. Have we seen specific approaches in specific countries that have worked particularly well?
I don't think so. I think we saw the differences that I said at the beginning. We saw the differences in the different countries, but the incidence numbers rates were totally different. Yeah. So when you start with an incident rate of, let's say, 200, that means you have 200 people getting infected by 100,000 from 100,000 people. So when you have now 50,000 people in a stadium and you would not make any tests, it can happen that you have 100 people which are infected in the stadium. If you have an incidence of 5 and you let 20,000 people into a stadium, then you have one person in the stadium who is maybe infected, just from the statistic point of view. And so that makes a big difference. It makes a big difference how many people get infected in this country and in this special area where you have the football game.
All these matches have been, at outdoor venues, but the Olympics would have been different. Some of those events would have taken place indoors, but now they're not going to have any spectators. Have they taken the right decision in Japan?
I don't know the incidents of Japan, but they are more careful. I think it would be possible in the arena outside that you have 10,000 or 20,000 people there. Indoors, it's a little bit more difficult, but also there it depends on the size of the room. In very large rooms, the aerosol cloud is not very concentrated, and it's still diluted by the surrounding air. And in that way, so it's also not so risky. But I think it's a right decision when the incidences are rising in Japan to make it without spectators.
Right, an abundance of caution there. Dr. Gerhard Scheuch, thanks so much for joining us on the COVID-19 special.
You're welcome.
And now it's the part of the programme where we put one of your questions to our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
Will vaccines require annual booster shots?
No one really knows the answer to this question yet, because the very first recipients of vaccines approved for emergency use were only given those shots around a year ago in the course of the initial trials. But it wouldn't come as a surprise if booster shots proved necessary at some point down the line. After all, they are for vaccines aimed at some other diseases. What's clear so far is that most people who receive approved vaccines, that they're protected to a great extent for at least 6 months, at least against the current common variants. Although the extent of that protection is, of course, not fixed, but varies from vaccine to vaccine and from variant to variant. But studies are showing, for instance, that people vaccinated with messenger RNA vaccines, that they continue to produce quite high levels of antibodies half a year after receiving their second doses, and effectiveness levels seem to be holding up quite well, at least against older variants of the virus. But a new report from Israel's Ministry of Health has now thrown some doubt on whether the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 might be able to do an end run on at least one vaccine more often than other variants, at least in part because of that new data. Pfizer and BioNTech now want to give recipients a third shot of their vaccine after 6 months, which highlights the big what if lurking in the background. What if the virus mutates enough to start infecting a much larger percentage of vaccinated people on a regular basis, and even worse, is able to cause severe disease in them? That's when we'll really need a tailored booster shot. And actually, the companies that make COVID vaccines are already trialing next generation shots aimed at stopping that scenario if it starts to unfold. Mixing and matching different vaccines in the first 2 doses could also possibly help provide the kind of broader spectrum immune response necessary to keep even slippery future variants in check. So, in a nutshell, while there's no strong indication yet that our current vaccines won't continue to protect us, maybe even for a long time to come, if new variants start to seriously infect large numbers of fully vaccinated people, then we'll see the rapid rollout of tweaked booster shots.